81 through to, no.
Hey everybody.
Oh, hello. Hello there, welcome back to the Tiny Workshop. I'm John Madden.
I'm Patrick Holcomb.
And we're back here again. I feel like we're just discussing, we were watching Doctor Who during COVID lockdown. Well, I have. What have you been up to?
Yeah, a bit of TV. Some workshop time.
Workshop time.
Mainly workshop time, yeah. It's good to be back in the workshop, that's for sure.
It's been a difficult time here in Melbourne. A few people out there have no doubt been in the same situation that we have. So what have you been doing this week? Anything fun?
One of the things I've been messing around with, of course, is this chair that we started a couple of weeks ago. I did make some progress and I've got some materials to show you some actual cutting, less talking.
No talking, more cutting, yeah?
More action starting very soon. So yeah, I'll be doing that in a sec.
And tonight I'm going to attempt to make a full lap joint by hand using hand tools to illustrate another technique of being able to create joinery with basic equipment. So I'm going to get out of your hair.
No worries.
And you can get on with what you're doing.
Excellent. All right. Well, first up, this is still in bits and pieces, but this is the chair design that I landed on. I mean, if you've seen the other episodes, you'll see that whole process in great detail as to why I went through all of those designs. But what I'm going to focus on today is making that key joint where the leg meets those two rails. So it's a three-way joint using 42 by 42 pre-dressed timber from the hardware store that is comprised of this leg section, which is rebated on two sides. You've got a rail section which has that notch there, and the reason it has that is so that it can receive a third piece, excuse me while I hold these awkwardly, in like that. So I'm just going to run through a few tips on the drop saw, basically walking through that joint. First of all, drop saws, not crazy accurate, and so one thing that you can do that will really help that is build yourself an auxiliary fence. I know my drop saw, if you looked at the fence from above, it's not parallel like that. It's actually a bit of a banana. I placed a piece of melamine in front of there, and then I put a few shims in the back. Just use whatever you want, some thin material. Venetian blind, ex-Venetian blind bits of aluminium, great for shimming. I double-sided taped them to the fence to support those boards. And then you can just cut right through that, and you have essentially like a zero clearance auxiliary fence, which is dead flat, unlike the fence on this old Makita drop saw. Once you've done that, you need to make sure that your blade is actually cutting directly 90 degrees to that fence, and that's a matter of just making a cut, checking it with your square, adjusting it if you need to. But doing that will make all of this a lot easier. I mean, one of the problems with this material is it's not dead square, so do whatever you can to make other things square instead. So, first up, I'm just going to measure out one of these pieces at 450 millimeters. That's the length of my leg. If you're using pre-dressed hardware store timber, never just measure from the end that they've cut. Always cut your end off first, then make your measurement. Their end is never any good. Don't trust it. When you're marking out, you can use a pencil if your eyesight's no good. I prefer to use a little tiny knife. It gets you a much sharper point to cut against. Make sure you can see it. If you can't see it, you can then run over it with a pencil. A great tip from Gary Rizzolo, pencil sharpener won't get your pencil sharp enough. You can just run it on a piece of sandpaper and you get a knife edge on that, and that'll get you a nice clean line. So now we have what is going to be our leg. We need to mark out where this joint's going to be. Now the way I've designed this, I have 19 mil sticking out of the top of this joint, and the seat will sit in there and it'll be some 19 mil stock. So that's why my rebate is going to start at 19 mil. The best way to do that, use the actual stock that you're going to use the seat for to mark out that first line. So I'm going to place that on a flat surface, use my pencil, which I've sharpened, as I mentioned, draw that line, and that's exactly, it doesn't matter if it's 19 mil or not, it's the thickness of the stock we're using. So that's the starting point. Similarly, we want to use the rail material to mark out that rebate. One thing I found with this stuff is there could be up to a millimetre of difference, which is horrendous and makes it very difficult to build furniture. But rather than just assuming it's going to be 42, it won't be. It'll be something slightly different. So, well, use this, which is going to be rail. I'm going to write rail 1 on it. I'm going to write rail 1. I'm going to just put a 1 on that as well. And I know that these two go together and they will always go together. So once I've cut this joint, it'll be for this piece. That's the way they're always going to fit, even if all of these pieces are not exactly the same size. Okay, that's marked out, and I want to do the rebate. Now, you need to be able to use a depth stop on your miter saw. Mine just flips out like that, and it means instead of the blade going all the way through the bed, it stops just here. I've set that height so that it just barely touches this piece of stock here, which is just a piece of ply that I've chosen. And this is, what is it, 29 millimeters thick. The reason I've done that is because that leaves me a really nice sized rebate of 13 millimeters from my 42 mil stock. So 42 minus 29 is 13, I believe. Pretty sure that's right. But you want to make sure that you're not sending your saw to the full depth of that cut, because we want to clean it up a little bit with the chisel. If you send it too deep, the bottom will be super rough and it won't make a good join. So send it not all the way down. These machines have a lot of flex in them, and if you put a ton of weight on here, you'll be able to influence how deep the blade goes into the timber. You want to keep that pressure consistent, otherwise your cuts won't be consistent. The reason this spacer is here is because the way these sliding saws work, if you go all the way to the back and you were trying to make your rebate there, the curve of the blade means you're not getting a flat cut there. It actually curves up there. So you need the deepest part of the blade to be able to engage the timber the whole way through the cut, which is why I've placed that spacer there, as well as depth stopping the saw. I'm going to start doing my cut. I'm going to start at that 19 mil line. I'm going to do a series of cuts until I'm right near that other line, but haven't cut it yet. And then I'm going to do a series of creeping cuts where I just move it ever so slightly until I get a perfect fit. You can just knock that stock out. We don't need the bottom to be clean just yet. We just need to make sure we can get our piece in there to see if it fits. Make sure you're using the right end of it. It's a little bit too tight, so I need to do a fraction of a cut. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to place my piece in there, I'm going to bring the blade down, and I'm going to just touch the side wall up to the blade. Now, what you can do is apply a tiny bit of pressure, which will just slightly deflect that blade, just a fraction. And you're using that so that you have some friction there, so that you know that you're just doing a fraction of a millimeter. Don't cut too much or you will overshoot this. I've done it so many times where I thought I was being careful and I've overshot it. I might have to creep up on this on a few cuts, but hopefully I'll get it pretty quickly. That's actually perfect. I expected to have to do another one, but I have been doing this all week, so, you know, got pretty good. Okay, that is the dado cut. We're going to go to a really quick break, and then after the break, I'll show you a really simple method for cleaning out the base of that join. Okay, time for some chisel work. Now, look, last week I talked about how I didn't want to rely too heavily on what I consider finer hand tool skills. I think it does take time to be good at chisel work, but what I want to show you is a simple way to do this cleanly and easily. Like I said before, when we were using that spacer and it was 29mm thick, I've got some of the same stuff here. You don't have to use this black ply, I just had it lying around and it was the right thickness. I'm going to use this as a chisel guide, that I'm going to place the chisel along, and that's going to set my height for the base of this rebate here. So, I've got the rebate, I've got my guide, and I've got a bash plate, which is just a piece of timber behind there that the chisel can run into. It means I can hold it more safely and not run the chisel into my fingers, which is a very real concern. So just because using a chisel seems quiet and slow, it doesn't mean you can't do real damage with them. So, I'm going to clamp that together to make sure it doesn't move. Ideally, you want it to be on a pretty flat surface, which is why I have this piece of ply here. And yep, that's feeling pretty good. So I'm going to rest the chisel on this piece of black ply. I'm going to use my thumb to apply a bunch of pressure, and I'm going to just push it forward into that material to get a really perfectly flat base. And the way you will get a really good flat base is doing it bit by bit. This is a 12mm chisel. For the first cut, there's quite a lot of wood that you're pushing away. So you might want to actually, rather than putting it flat on that piece of ply, the first cut, you might not do it full depth. You might do it halfway through the remaining material, take off a sliver of that, and then go down to the bottom of that cut and clean it up. Once you've done one channel all the way to the back, work your way along that rebate, taking it millimetre by millimetre, and you'll get a really nice clean base. Another thing you can do, if you feel like you're ramping up slightly, which does happen, is you can flip this around and do that from the other side. A good sharp chisel is super important. I mean, you'll have a really hard time getting a nice clean face if your chisel isn't sharp. You don't need a whole set of very fancy chisels, but you do need a chisel that is sharp and that you trust, and you've got to know how to sharpen it. When you're joining this, if you're finding it's not going together, I can almost guarantee the culprit will be in these tight corners. That is where crud accumulates. It's where you haven't removed all of the waste, and the edges of your piece, luckily I labelled it, won't get right into those corners. So that'll be one of the first places I'll check if you're not getting a really good clean join. You might need to come at it from a few directions. But just go slow. It's so easy to remove too much material. And we'll just check that. It's a nice firm fit, and that's what's going to provide us with a strong joint, because it means those walls are making really good contact. That's looking pretty good on this side. Looks a bit sloppy on that side, but I don't want to focus too much on accuracy right now because I've got a lot of stuff to show you. I think that'll do for now. What I would like to show you just quickly is just a tip for gluing these up. This softwood is so absorbent, and especially this end grain here, it is inherently a terrible glue surface for two reasons. The end grain tends to just soak up glue like a sponge, and then when you go and glue it together, the glue is all absorbed into the joint rather than staying in those two faces. Also, because all of the fibres are facing this direction, you don't have a lot of fibres lying side by side that provide a good glue surface. Luckily, because we've got three faces which are all providing a nice tight fit, that will be a strong joint. But what I would recommend doing is applying some glue to this end grain. You can be generous with it, spread it out evenly, and then I'd like you to leave that to sit for 5 minutes or so until it goes tacky. You might find that you need to add a little bit more. I think generally this is called sizing with glue, and it means that you're allowing the timber to pre-absorb some material. It's worth doing it on the inside of these bits too, especially the end grain. You'll find that the long grain won't really absorb glue in the same way, but on softwood it's still worth considering. And if you do that, spread that around, leave it for a few minutes before you clamp it up, you'll find you get a much better joint. However, it is worth noting, when you add moisture to end grain like this, you're inherently going to have some swelling, which will mean that that perfectly firm but movable joint that you made will suddenly be really tight, and you might need to apply pressure rapidly once you get that joint together, because you just won't be able to get it in there. So I would recommend having everything lined up and a clamp that can provide ample pressure if you are going to do this. You'll be amazed at how difficult that gets if you get that halfway in and you don't get it pressed all the way in. So that has absorbed some glue. I reckon I'll put that together now. Watch me struggle. This is the fun bit to do live because something always goes wrong. You also want to make sure that the edges are where you want them to be, because once that's together, you're not going to be able to move it. Even now, I probably wouldn't be able to move that. It's nice to have a clamp that does in fact apply parallel pressure, otherwise it's really easy for this joint to skew. So I have a damp rag here. It's worth cleaning up all glue as early as you can. It's a lot harder afterwards, and if you leave glue on there and you try and put some finish on there, it'll show up and look terrible. This is just standard PVA. If your joints are really atrocious, you could use an epoxy, but PVA will do a great job on this. I'm going to leave that for now, and we're going to head to a quick segment where John has some tips, and I'll hand over to him and let him teach you something.
Welcome to this tiny workshop, tiny tips segment. Today we're going to talk about drawings briefly. You may have seen Patrick facing his nemesis of making his first chair. So I thought, let's spend a little time looking at what kind of drawings you need to be familiar with if you're going to start making furniture or stuff like that. Essentially, there's 3 types of drawings that you need to know about as a woodworker. The plan drawing. The plan drawing is a bird's eye view of the project you're making. So imagine we're making a credenza. From the bird's eye view, it looks like that. Let's say it's 600 deep, 1800 long. That's your plan view. The next important drawing is the elevation, which is the vertical view of the piece you're making. So our credenza looks like this. 2 sliding doors, 2 drawers, 900 millimeters high. And the third type of drawing that you would consider is a detail drawing. So in this case, we have a detail drawing of a drawer. $100 high, 600 millimeters wide. A detail drawing. So now you've got your 3 essential drawings, your plan view, your elevation, and your detail drawings. How are you going to manage these while you're making your piece? You don't want them lying around as loose pieces of paper. They'll get damaged or they'll get lost. What I like to do is to tape them to a board. So now you've got all your essential drawings all together, stuck to a piece of board. Why would you do that? Well, it's great. It keeps them all together. It's a hard surface that you can write on when you're in the workshop, and it makes them easy to store. Thanks for watching the Tiny Workshop Tiny Tips segment. Now I'm appreciating that I think I may have, what do they say, bit off more than you can chew. I'm going to make a fully marked out lap joint with these two pieces of wood, not timber, in 5 minutes. So I haven't practiced today, but I did manage to sharpen my chisel. Because what happens when a lot of people get into woodworking, they go down to the hardware shop and they buy some of this pine and they think, it's cheap, so therefore it must be good. Well, actually that's sort of not true, but the problem with radiata pine like this is that it's very coarse and you actually need a really sharp chisel in order to cut a proper joint. Now, this chisel's pretty sharp. It's not Rizzolo sharp. It's probably more like John Madden sharp, but I'm sure it'll do the job. So I've got all my stuff. I'm going to lay this across here. So the first thing I will do is just draw a line across the piece of timber where you want to lay this particular joint. I'm just going to, we're not making anything in particular here. We're just making a lap joint. And continue that edge, that line, over the edges like so. I might add too, and I think that Patrick mentioned it earlier, that this stuff's not square when you buy it. So I have run this through the machines to clean it up a little bit. Just important to do that, otherwise your joinery will not fall together. So once I've got this line, I don't know if you can see that there. Can you see that there? Yeah. I'm going to use the other piece of wood as the actual gauge of how wide the joint will be. Rather than trying to measure it, you can't measure that accurately. It's better to actually use the other piece of wood. And like Patrick earlier, I'm using a knife as well. Pencils are for builders, not for furniture makers. So, not claiming to be a great furniture maker or anything like that, but let you know. You will not get a tight joint. So you want to lay this first piece of timber right up over that line. So it almost obscures it. I can't define that exactly, except excuse it, yeah? So lay that there and then just take your knife again and just mark it on the back side. Mark it out across the joint, working off this. Work off the top edge. It helps with your accuracy if you do that. I love this old square. I don't even know where I got it. It just appeared in my life. It's been a real pleasure to use for years. And so, again, we're not making a job in any sort of thing in particular, so I'm just going to set this marking gauge. This one, it also just appeared in my life once. At any old depth. So let's say roughly half the thickness. Oh, watch when you're using a marking gauge, just like there, it'll follow the grain. Being coarse, it's exactly what it's done. So that's dodgy already. Turn it over. We'll try a little better this time. Not too much pressure. I'm rushing a bit here to get this done, so not too much pressure. And you'll get a nice tight line like that. And that's what you're really looking for. So now we have this laid out. I use this little piece of traction mesh in order to stop it sliding all over the bench. I'll grab this little saw. I use Japanese saws. This is a nice one. They sell them at TimberCon. Seems to do the job well. So just try and get that right up next to that line. Gently saw. Right down to your cross line like so. And do the same on the other side. I want a little bit close. I feel like a performing seal doing this, but we will persist. All right, so don't get too excited. Japanese saws, as you all know, they're all cut on the pull stroke. And with a piece of pine like this, it's probably worth just doing a few little relief cuts to help relieve that material. like so. Now what I'm going to do is clamp this to the bench so I can whack it with a chisel. Where's the clamps gone? Oh, here we go. Look at that. Magically waiting. Just using a little block like so. Patrick's used the other one for his glue up. Let's see if we've got enough here. So using the chisel with the bevel down first, we're going to come in onto this joint and remove the bulk of the material. Stop about halfway. If you stop about halfway, it means you won't tear the back out. If you go right through, you can pull the back side of your joint face out, which is not cool. So come a little closer so we get a better grip. And this time we'll just, so you want to aim for a little mound cutting from each side. And once you removed all that material with the bevel down, you just turn your chisel over. So you've got the flat of the chisel back down. And now you can move through and remove that excess. Working your way, a little like what Patrick did before, you're working your way down to that line that you marked out, which is essentially the last cut that you want to make. So the last cut, to get a nice flat surface, you insert the chisel into that marked out line and just push through. Looks okay. Turn it over. Or round, sorry. Do the same again. Using the chisel. It's not a Rizzolo sharp though. Did anyone see that episode of TimberCon Live where we shaved someone's leg? That was Rizzolo sharp. We'll do that again one day. Hopefully next time someone will watch the program, but we'll see. Okay, so we're just doing that. Get it flat. It's okay. And so the next step is to remove that shoulder. And this time, grab your chisel like a fist. Come into that line, like so. Looking down the blade. 2 cuts to create that shoulder. Same again on the back side. This is when you know if your chisel's sharp or not, because pine will just tear, it won't actually cut. It's okay. And what we can do now, using the vise, is drop that piece of wood in there and then just remove that, whoops, remove that little last part on the outer edge. You don't want to cut that with the chisel with your fist because it tears it out. So just pare it back. Clean it up a bit. If we had more time, you could get in there with a little square and make sure it's all super accurate, but I have done this before, so I'm hoping that I can wing it. But it's more about pair in from each side so you don't tear that outside edge. clean that up a little bit, It's not bad, but I don't know, slightly over 5 minutes. Okay, so will it fit? Well, yeah, it fits okay. It needs a little bit tightening up, but you can see essentially that that's actually holding together without glue. It's pretty tight. So the way to get tight joinery by hand is to use a knife, use a scribe, using a little square and a sharp chisel. And probably taking a little bit more time than I did to do this. So anyway, that's my little demonstration of how to do a lap joint. What do you think, Patrick?
I think you've done a great job considering the time.
Don't look at that side though. Yeah.
It's you know, it's fitting together pretty tightly, and I mean the process is much the same in a lot of ways to what I was doing. You know, you do those cuts, you remove some waste,
yeah,
and then you go and clean it up.
Good.
Something I found teaching at Handsome & Co. is that scribing, especially on softwood, it's the thing that students struggle with.
It's funny you should say that because I used to teach a bit of woodwork when I lived in Queensland, and hottest place on earth. And I found that people struggled the most with this tool.
Yeah.
Because they're trying to put too much pressure on it, and you saw me do it.
It just rides that grain.
It rides the grain
Yeah.
straight out, particularly on softwoods like...
Yeah, you want to do the lightest touch until you've built up an actual trough that's not the grain, but cut by the tool.
Yeah.
But no, I think you've done a great job.
Well, there you go. All right, so what are you doing next week?
I really want to get this chair wrapped up. So I've got a couple final joints. I'll put this seat on, and there's a little bit of reinforcing I want to do on those back joints where the chair back meets the seat, because that's the point of weakness. So we'll talk about that.
Yep,
what are you up to?
I'm going to take some machined wood and do a lamination. So just a straight out lamination, no fancy curves or anything, but how to widen materials.
Like for a bench top?
Like for a bench top.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about some preliminary work to make a bench top. So...
sounds good.
Yeah.
Nice work.
Okay, everybody out there, thanks very much for joining us here in the Tiny Workshop. I'm John Madden.
Patrick Holcomb.
Please join us again next time.
All right.